Jason Kenney may have announced his long goodbye as Alberta Premier, but the attacks on churches that began on his watch, well, they continue on. Today, I'll give you an update on Edmonton's Church in the Vine with regard to their convictions and potential hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines for not allowing a public health officer to disrupt their active church services. Then I'm going to ask you to help us fight back and to get involved in the fight in a couple of different ways. Do you know the story of Church in the Vine from Edmonton, Alberta? They were recently convicted, along with one of the pastors there, Pastor Tracy, of obstructing a public health officer who tried repeatedly to barge into active church services to check for COVID compliance. It's outrageous. Initially, the church faced over $1 million in fines. The fines they still face are enormous. We'll get to that number in a second, but first the backstory. Pastor Tracy did not obstruct the public health officer violently. Tracy actually didn't even refuse an inspection. In fact, the public health officer Tracy's convicted of obstructing remarked on how polite Tracy was. Tracy simply told the public health officer to come back at a different time when people were not actively worshiping and praying, to leave the little Sunday school children in peace, and to kindly stay out of the sanctuary when her husband, Pastor Rodney, was on the pulpit. Tracy did what any pastor would do when tasked with shepherding their flock. She protected them and the sanctity of their worship from the intrusion of the state. And now, Church in the Vine and Tracy are each convicted of 3 counts of obstruction, and they face crippling fines. Prosecutor Karen Thorsrud, who insists on remaining anonymous in the court, though there is no publication ban on her identity, has asked the judge in Edmonton to levy $120,000 in fines. It's completely unheard of, especially when Pastor Tracy simply wanted the inspector to come back and look at Church in the Vine and their COVID protocols sometime other than during active worship. Now, I've got a plan to fight back. First, we've got a petition at savepastortracy.com. Find it, share it, sign it. We're going to deliver this petition to every single United Conservative Party candidate who is angling to replace Jason Kenney as premier. Their first order of duty should be to back off on the pastors and the churches and the business owners and the everyday Albertans who are still fighting these COVID fines in court. And we as Albertans need to know where these people stand on COVID lockdowns and fines. Okay, so that's the first part of my plan. You're going to hear from Pastor Tracy and her husband, Pastor Rodney, in today's video. Then we're going to hear from their lawyer, James Kitchen. And then I'm going to tell you what else we are doing to help Church in the Vine and Pastor Tracy. Take a listen. Tracy and Rodney, thank you for having me in your home. There are times where I've been in your home. I think the last time in it was still illegal.
I think it was. We snuck you in.
That's right. Now, I wanted to ask you about what happened this week, because we had sentencing submissions on your convictions, 3 for you and 3 for the church, on obstruction of a public health officer. The Crown, initially, when I was talking to your lawyer previously, thought maybe in the ballpark of $333,000. The Crown thinks she's being reasonable by asking for $120,000, which seems so far out of the ballpark. Why do you think she's asking for so much?
Well, I don't think there's any doubt that she's looking to make an example. She went overboard in comparing us, and she used terms like super spreader. How many times did she refer to us that way? So I know she's just looking to make an example.
Yeah, you spoke woman to woman, woman of discernment to woman of discernment. Mm-hmm. Why was it important for you to address the judge like that?
Oh, that's a big question. Going back to the trial, because she refused to hear the charter portion of our argument, when the time came and our lawyer, James Kitchen, said, "I have no further questions, Your Honor," I felt a little ripped off because I had gone in prepared to say so much. Mm-hmm. I wanted to elaborate on a lot of the discussion that had been had, but we only very briefly touched on it. So I really did want an opportunity to be able to speak to her, and I did. It was in some ways harder than the testimony because I wasn't answering questions. I was, well, like you said, I'm looking her in the eye and speaking to her as a almost on a common. Well, I tried to appeal to her just as a peer almost. in as much as we're both responsible for people, for people's very lives. She has decisions to make every day that affect the rest of people's lives, and we do too.
Now, your case is interesting not only because it is, this nice little pastor lady who stood up to the government and the state really wants their pound of flesh out of you. Your lawyer pointed out that where people are belligerently opposing inspection, they're only getting $750 in fines, and they're seeking $120,000 in your case. People might think, oh, the pandemic is over, the fines should be dropped, but they're not. Jason Kenney's gone, but his legacy of attacks on the church, it's still happening.
I know that we had all hoped this summer that we could put COVID behind us once and for all. That was certainly my hope, and I said so very clearly. Based on our analysis of other jurisdictions around the world with similar rates of vaccination, we believed that we could prudently move away from addressing COVID as a pandemic and towards an endemic. It is now clear that we were wrong, and for that, I apologize.
We need to view every gas pump, every walk through a mall, every pass through a store door, every stair railing or escalator as an opportunity to prevent COVID spread. With unknown transmission sources at current levels, there are cases that we still don't know about. Every one that spreads is a threat to the health of others. Every one that spreads is a threat to the healthcare system. Every one that spreads means the potential for more intrusive measures in the future.
I don't know what to say about that, other than it seems terribly unfair. But, like I said to the judge yesterday, we've been in ministry in various capacities for nearly 30 years. And I can count on one hand the number of things that I would do different if I could. And none of them are in the last 2 years.
I think one thing that Pastor Tracy did say to the judge was that what we're doing is for the rest of Canadians. Mm-hmm. You need to realize out there, for those of you that are listening to this interview, realize that what we're doing is, it's not just for us in Church in the Vine, but it's for every church now and those that will come after us. We're setting precedent for what's coming. If people can just come into the churches and disrupt our services anytime they choose, then we've really lost the fundamental rights and freedoms that we have as Canadians, and it just can't be like that. So somebody has to stand up, and we said yes, and we're happy, very proud that we could be counted and that we could actually be part of this.
It is important to note, I think, that back from the trial, a little part of it that maybe got glossed over by the majority of people that are following the story is that the judge deemed our church, the church, as a public place. Mm-hmm. That's a big deal, because if the church is public, that makes it open to anybody, everybody, anytime, day or night, for any reason. That's a really big deal, and it has huge implications. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we absolutely have to fight this. I'll share something that I shared with the judge on Wednesday. And it took a lot out of me. It really did. Like I said, she was standing so close to me and she didn't take her eyes off me. I know I had her attention. So I'm grateful, very grateful for that, because I know that a big part of the reason I was there on Wednesday was for her. Mm-hmm. I believe a big part of this whole ordeal with the court system is for her. Her name is Judge Sheila Cray, and we are praying for her. We're praying ultimately for her salvation. And one thing that I said to her was that none of us is promised tomorrow. I said, today's a good day. Today's a good day for you to find your salvation. And we're all going to stand before the Lord one day and give an account. I said that to her. I can't believe I said that to her. I said, we all have to stand before him and give an account regarding the responsibility and the gifts and the opportunities that have been put before us. So my challenge would be for your listeners, and again, for the judge as well, to consider this a good day. It's a good day for salvation, because we're not promised tomorrow. So we're grateful. We're grateful for today.
James, can you give us an update to what happened during sentencing submissions in court on Wednesday?
Sure, yeah. So we appeared in court for about an hour and a half to talk about what type of sentence Church in the Vine and Pastor Tracy should get. And in this case, that's going to be a fine. I will note that The Crown probably would have liked to have jailed Pastor Tracy Fortin if that was an available penalty. It's not in the Public Health Act, interestingly enough. It's just fines. So the Crown said that if Pastor Tracy cannot pay the fines, she should go to jail in order to pay that penalty, which was a bit bizarre and over the top. What normally happens, just so people understand this, is if you can't pay a fine, it's called civil enforcement, which is to say that there's mechanisms in place that people come after your property or your income or whatever to get that money and get it paid, right? You don't typically go to jail if you don't pay a fine. So it was pretty extreme that the Crown actually asked for Pastor Tracy Fortin to go to jail if she can't pay the fine. But that's consistent. She was the one, of course, who asked for Pastor Coates to be jailed originally when all this jailing pastors thing started. So the Crown was asking for, in total, up to $120,000 worth of fines for Church in the Vine and Pastor Tracy Fortin. Keep in mind, this is only 3 counts of obstruction.
Yeah, it's when you talk about, obeying the law versus allowing yourself to be governed through consent. I've never seen in my 4 decades of life on this earth such an outbreak of civil disobedience. And that should be a clue to the lawmakers, to the court system, that people do not consent to this law. We've got a problem here with these restrictions. And it is people from all walks of life, and particularly with the pastors, all different styles, all different, faith traditions. We've got, the Church of God in Aylmer, sort of from a Anabaptist tradition. We've got charismatic evangelicals, the way Pastor Tracy and her husband are. Then there's Pastor Art in Calgary, more bombastic. Pastor Tim Stevens and James Coates, more scholarly in their approach to their faith and religion. But all of these people, regardless of their style, regardless of whether or not they're your personal taste, they're taking dignified and principled stances against what they see as a bad law. And that should be a clue, I think, to the powers that be, that this is not just COVID scofflaws, as the media likes to call them. These are people who see this law as fundamentally wrong.
Yeah, it's a very good point. If you have a society and if you have politicians that are paying attention, that's something you immediately look at for, what would be the natural boundaries of where government should go. One of the points I made in sentencing is, look, this is a regulatory offense, which is to say it's not criminal, but you could still be fined for it, kind of like a traffic ticket. And the Crown's big thing was, well, look, it comes to regulated activities. If you choose to engage in them, you got to do them in a way that protects the public. But that misses the point. Church is not a regulated activity. It never was, it never could be, and it's wrong to try to. And that's exactly what's happening here. And so, of course, what happens is when you try to regulate something that cannot and should not ever be regulated, what do you get? You get a mess, right? You get people resisting, you get people engaged in civil disobedience, you get the loss of freedom, you get the imposition of absurd fines, you get all that because you have oil and water and you're trying to make them mixed, and they shouldn't. And that should be a signal to anybody who's like, okay, wait a minute. Yeah, you know what? We should maybe try to do something about health, but we have to leave certain things alone. Church, free speech, right? Personal lives, families coming over for Christmas. There's certain things that we have to leave alone because they're just too important for human society and human flourishing. Right? Why do we get all these problems with the all the extra suicides and all the extra deaths from loneliness and the nursing homes? And why do we get that? Because we've forgotten that as humans, we're humans and not robots.
You made a point in your sentencing submissions that it is difficult for secular and modern people, as you said, to understand what was happening at Church in the Vine, because the prosecutor is arguing this was a potential super spreader event, except it never was. She was trying to put extra evidence in sentencing. She was trying to say, oh, there was an outbreak. And then she said one case of coronavirus related to the church, but that was never in evidence. And she was trying to say, how reckless of them to endanger the community is her argument, which is why she wants $120,000 in fines for this peaceful lady. And you made the point, it is very difficult for secular people to understand that even if the prosecutor's argument were true, that this was some sort of potentially super spreader mass casualty event, it's difficult for the secular people to understand that even if that were true, it is worth the cost to obey God for Tracy and her congregation.
Yeah, exactly. And, it's really too bad, because if there was some humility involved on the part of the court and the Crown, then we would have at least been able to have that argument. It's this, I almost borderline religious prejudice, but certainly arrogance and hubris of, well, you religious nut jobs, you don't know better. You're anti-science, and you're anti-rule and order, and you don't understand as well as we do. So we're not even going to give you the time of day. We're not going to let you make your arguments. We don't care about your so-called constitutional rights. Let's get this done. Let's get this over with. Right? And that was the attitude of the Crown and the court when our application to discuss charter rights was dismissed at trial. Is this? And because remember, the judge looked at me. She's like, just because the officer was there on Sunday morning worship, you think you got a claim for religious freedom? And I said, yes.
Of
and
course.
she looked at me like I was crazy,
Yeah.
and I looked at her like she was crazy.
Yeah.
Right? And that's the divide, right? I think the Crown in this case, of course, she levied these obstruction charges and no other charges, because these charges were the really easy ones to prove factually. There's no getting around it that it factually happened and that the legal test is met. But I find it interesting that she dropped all the other charges, right? Even though she tried to bring in evidence of these super spreader events, she didn't charge for that, and then when she did, she dropped it, which that should be saying something right there. So this was always a tough case because it was only these obstruction charges. And my argument was always going to be, well, look, there's a charter rights breach by this officer when she just barges in on it during Sunday morning worship, right? Not some other time, during worship. And so when I made my charter argument and the court struck it down, I didn't have much left. And so the whole basis of the appeal is, look, it's a mistrial. When you go to trial and you're in a new situation like this, brand new in the law. We never had something like this before. And in the church, or the pastor in this case, says, look, I want to argue my charter section 2A religious freedom rights, right? Maybe I won't make the case out. You're going to get to decide that, but I want to argue it. And then the judge comes in and says, no, we're not going to waste our time hearing your stupid charter argument, as if the Constitution is not the supreme law of the country. Well, you create a mistrial. We had a mistrial. We didn't have a real trial. We didn't have a proper trial. We had a mistrial because there was this piece that was critical to the whole case that was just arbitrarily pushed to the side. So that's the whole basis of my appeal, is to say, look, we got to go back and do this again and do it right and bring in the evidence and talk about charter rights. And maybe the court will rule against us and say there was no breach, but we at least need to be able to talk about it. And if we're not, it's a mistrial. So that's the whole basis of my appeal. And, we may get back there and we may lose, and then, the fines have to be paid. But at least let's do it right. At least let's embarrass everybody involved in this whole thing by talking about just how awful what they did was to these congregants and these pastors.
The crackdown on churches in Alberta is something that we would normally see happening in communist China or authoritarian Iran or some of the more tyrannical anti-freedom places of the world. And the Alberta government is counting on us to forget the last 2 years and forget what they continue to do. We're supposed to move on and get on with our lives, but how could we? How dare we when this persecution is still firmly in place? We are going on a comprehensive public awareness campaign that I don't want to give too much away of quite yet, but stay tuned because it's going to be good. The Alberta government thinks that the public's attention has moved away from COVID, and so the persecution of the churches can sort of continue in the background without anybody noticing or caring. Oh no, not on my watch. I'm going to make sure as many people as possible know what is happening to Pastor Tracy every single day in my own special way. So stay tuned for that. But I'm also going to need your help because Pastor Tracy and Church in the Vine's legal fees have been supported through your generous crowdfunding donations to fightthefines.com. And that's in partnership with the registered Canadian charity, the Democracy Fund. Tracy's got souls to save and a congregation to take care of. She should not be worrying about and spending church money on a legal battle with the province for the right to be obedient to God. Pastor Tracy and Church in the Vine has a really great lawyer, James Kitchen, and he's been advised to launch an appeal of the convictions. This judgment should not remain on the books in a way that it can be used against the next pastor during the next pandemic and the next lockdown, because it's going to happen again. So if you want to help, Crowdfund that appeal. It's very easy. Just go to that same website, savepastortracy.com, make a donation. And the beauty of that donation is that it is tax deductible through that partnership with the Democracy Fund. For Rebel News, I'm Sheila Gunn Reid. Pastor Tracy and Church in the Vine face $120,000 in fines, convicted of several counts of obstructing a public health officer that barged into the church during active worship services. They have better things to do with that money. And this conviction cannot stand because it will indeed be used against the next church during the next lockdown. We have to fight back. If you'd like to help fund the appeal of those convictions, please consider making a tax-deductible donation at savepastortracy.com.